Murmurs had rippled through the courtroom benches as the photograph from 1912 circled between calloused hands and gloved fingers. Each face that bent over the faded image then lifted toward the man at the center table, comparing jawlines, hairline, the slight forward tilt of his shoulders. The elderly neighbor, leaning heavily on a cane, repeated that he had seen that same silhouette cross the courtyard before troops departed in 1914, and again when they limped home years later, unchanged. On the stand, physicians unfolded charts and X-ray plates, their voices steady but edged with unease. They described arterial walls that remained unexpectedly flexible, joints that showed only minimal degeneration, and a resting heart rate more typical of a man in his 40s. Yet the registry books, tax records, and an 1868 birth entry from a provincial parish office all converged on the same date. One doctor, adjusting his spectacles, admitted that no known endocrine disorder precisely matched what they observed. Outside the Palais de Justice, newsboys had waved evening editions that framed him as a marvel and a potential imposter in equal measure. Columnists speculated about glandular experiments, obscure diets, and even the lingering effects of wartime gas exposure, while others recalled earlier tales of unchanging faces in village legends and spiritualist salons. Inside, the man who called himself Henri Delorme sat motionless, hands folded, his features betraying no strain, as if long familiarity with scrutiny had steadied every muscle. In a small examination room, fluorescent lights reflected off glossy prints of photographs spread across a metal table. Childhood portraits from the 1960s lay beside high school yearbook images and laminated security badges from later decades. The face on each image carried the same smooth skin and unaltered jawline, framed by dark, ungraying hair. A physician traced a finger from one photo to the next, reading the printed dates aloud, then comparing them against a birth certificate that firmly placed the subject in middle age. In the adjacent lab, technicians calibrated machines used to measure hormone levels and telomere length. Blood samples labeled with coded numbers passed through automated analyzers, which reported values consistently falling within reference ranges for healthy adults. Telomere assays, repeated over several years, suggested cellular aging that roughly matched the chronological age on file. Yet, when independent clinicians reviewed only the physical examination notes and photographs, they estimated an age nearly 2 decades younger, documenting their surprise in the margins of the reports. At his workplace, staff entered a conference room where a researcher projected a timeline of group photos onto a screen. Colleagues in the images gained wrinkles, fuller faces, and greying hair as the years advanced, while one figure at the edge of each frame appeared almost unchanged. Former co-workers, seated around the table, recalled holiday parties and long project deadlines, describing how jokes about good genes gradually shifted into quiet concern. Their testimonies, taped and transcribed, noted the unsettling contrast between his static appearance and their own visible aging. In Vienna's municipal archives, the man's life unfolded in fragments of ink and paper. Arrest ledgers from the 1820s, 1830s, and 1840s listed roughly the same height, the same clear skin, the same thick, dark hair. Successive officers recorded a lean, almost boyish face beside dates that kept moving forward. One clerk noted, with irritation rather than wonder, that the prisoner looked no older than when he had first been processed many years earlier. Medical notes tucked into a police physician's diary added further detail. A pulse described as strong, teeth largely intact, no tremor of the hands and no visible greying despite a stated age well past 50. The doctor measured wrinkles at the eyes and mouth and remarked that their depth had not increased between examinations more than a decade apart. He wrote of good muscle tone, resilient skin, and an appearance fixed in middle youth that resisted the expected march of time. Far to the southeast, at the Ottoman court in Istanbul, diplomats observed a similar defiance of time. French and British envoys described a palace eunuch who greeted successive ambassadors with the same unlined face and steady posture over nearly 30 years. Watercolours and pencil sketches preserved in embassy collections showed minimal change in his features. Consular letters compared new observations with older dispatches and remarked almost uneasily that he seemed preserved, his age guessed but never visibly confirmed. Glassware clinked softly as physicians in starched coats leaned over stained laboratory benches, comparing hormone charts to faded case notes. In bound volumes of French and German journals, ink diagrams outlined patients whose faces resisted time: smooth skin, dark hair, clear eyes at ages when peers showed deep lines. Microscope lamps cast yellow circles over tissue slides, yet no obvious pathology appeared. The language of constitutional youthfulness emerged from these cramped rooms and handwritten tables. On a cluttered desk, a Dutch report from the 1930s lay open, its black and white photograph showing a woman with the features of a teenager despite a recorded age near 40. The text described regular menstruation, normal blood pressure, and unremarkable heart and lung examinations. A British reviewer underlined phrases noting preserved fertility and absence of osteoporosis. Beside these notes, crude basal metabolic rate calculations suggested no clear thyroid disease, forcing clinicians to describe normal organs inside a persistently youthful exterior. In another folder, hospital photographs from Japan traced a man across 25 years, his hair remaining dark, his face scarcely creased. Technicians had measured pituitary and gonadal hormones with early colorimetric assays that stained narrow test tubes in uneven hues, yet results stayed within accepted ranges. Radiographs showed well-mineralized bones and no pituitary enlargement. Doctors annotated the margins with doubts about hypopituitarism or gonadal failure, noting a largely typical lifespan and organ function paired with a conspicuous absence of visible aging. In private letters from Vienna, Paris, and St. Petersburg, diplomats described recognizing the same poised figure they called the Count of Saint-Germain, noting with unease that his face seemed unchanged across decades of postings. Courtiers repeated stories of meetings separated by 20 or 30 years, each time insisting he looked no older. Yet the dates on surviving passports, payment records, and housing contracts suggested several different men had traded on the name, allowing rumour to stitch their appearances into a single, ageless persona. Alessandro Cagliostro inspired similar unease. Pamphleteers accused him of sorcery while simultaneously remarking on a complexion that allegedly never sagged or dulled. Aristocratic memoirs described him materializing at salons in London, Paris, and Warsaw with the same dark curls and smooth skin. Later scholars compared these accounts with court arrest files and medical notes made during his imprisonment by the Inquisition, where witnesses finally recorded greying hair, weight gain, and the ordinary stiffness of middle age that legend had carefully ignored. In the 20th century, journalists cast Dick Clark, Sayuri Yoshinaga, and Andy Lau in a similar light, circulating side-by-side photographs that seemed to show faces suspended in time. Dermatologists pointed to disciplined sun avoidance, consistent weight, and early adoption of retinoid creams as likely explanations. Nutritionists emphasized stable sleep schedules and low tobacco and alcohol exposure. High-key studio lighting, controlled camera angles, and selective release of publicity images quietly removed the gradual wrinkles and softening visible in candid, unretouched photographs. In the clinic corridors, photographs of Brooke Greenberg rested beside dense tables of lab values and scan results. Her small frame, seated in a stroller at 16, matched the proportions of a toddler. At Johns Hopkins, radiologists read her X-rays and found a skeletal age years behind her birth date, while neurologists reviewed MRI images showing an unusually structured brain. Endocrinologists compared hormone panels, puzzled to see no pattern corresponding to any recognized syndrome. Physicians tracked each system of her body as though mapping an unfamiliar landscape. Dental development lagged, growth plates remained partially open, and some organs reflected infancy, while others matched later childhood. She experienced illnesses and hospitalizations, not as an ageless being, but as a patient whose tissues followed conflicting calendars. Despite exhaustive testing, genetic screens and metabolic panels failed to reveal a single causative mutation, suggesting a disruption spread across multiple growth and aging pathways. Conference halls then filled with slides of adults whose cases challenged expectations in subtler ways. A man in his 40s walked to the podium for examination, his face and posture resembling someone in early adulthood, his skin elastic and almost unlined. Bone density scans revealed values closer to youth, yet immune markers and reproductive hormones hinted at midlife. Clinicians documented these mismatches carefully, recognizing that normal chronology could separate from the body's visible and internal signs of age. In one dimly lit laboratory, a researcher adjusted a microscope focused on C. elegans, pointing to worms that had already outlived their normal span, yet still moved with surprising vigor. Nearby, charts traced the impact of altered IGF-1 signaling, each line representing a cohort whose clocks had been subtly slowed by single-gene mutations. White-coated figures compared these worms to long-lived mice and naked mole rats, noting shared signatures of reduced growth signals and heightened cellular repair. On another bench, frozen vials labeled with human codes emerged from liquid nitrogen, holding DNA from Laron syndrome patients and centenarians. Geneticists mapped variations in growth hormone receptors, FOXO-transcription factors, and lipid metabolism genes onto these samples, pointing to sequences that appeared again and again in the longest-lived individuals. In cluttered offices, interviewees recalled how these findings had challenged the assumption that aging followed a rigid timetable, instead revealing a spectrum of biological pacing. Case files lay open beside the sequencing data, documenting individuals whose faces and bodies had changed with unusual slowness over decades. Researchers compared hormone levels, metabolic markers, and family histories, searching for echoes of the same pathways seen in worms and rodents. Some subjects showed mildly blunted IGF-1 activity or resilient stress response profiles, hinting that their apparent lack of aging might not have been mystical at all, but an extreme convergence of rare protective genes and stable life conditions. The reanalysis of Henri Delorme's images unfolded under cold, standardized light. Investigators aligned his 1912 portrait with later photographs from the 1930s, fixing key anatomical landmarks across decades. Digital morphometrics traced minute shifts. The earlobes lengthened slightly, the helix thickened, and the jawline lost definition along its lower margin. Fine creases appeared fan-shaped at the corners of the eyes. These changes, invisible to casual observers, convinced of his agelessness, registered clearly in quantitative overlays. In the anonymized case of Michael, the same techniques mapped change more subtly. Over 30 years, the orbital rims descended fractionally, the nasolabial folds deepened, and the facial soft tissue redistributed while cranial proportions remained stable. Algorithms compared his facial metrics to population-based aging curves and estimated that his apparent age lagged by several years behind his chronological age. Stable body weight, consistent hairstyle, and nearly identical clothing styles further narrowed visual cues that usually signaled passing time. Psychologists measuring age perception showed how expectation shaped judgment. In controlled experiments, observers underestimated age when told that photographs depicted the same person over time, or when viewing images drawn from a tight social circle. These findings echoed the allure of supposed immortals on the internet, where low-resolution historical photographs resembled modern celebrities. Journalistic reconstructions exposed how coincidence, image noise, and confirmation bias converged to manufacture the impression of people who did not age at all. Hospital ledgers and autopsy tables held the answers that rumours had obscured. In the case of Henri Delorme, handwriting in fading ink gave precise dates: birth, hospital admissions, and a final entry recording his death in later life. Pathologists had opened his chest to find arteries stiffened and narrowed, heart muscle thickened and scarred, kidneys shrunken by years of strain. Tissue slides showed microscopic damage that matched a man in his 70s, not an ageless curiosity. In Japanese and European clinics, similar records accumulated around those once hailed as examples of perpetual youth. Photographs showed faces that stayed smooth through the 5th and even 6th decade, yet X-rays revealed thinning vertebrae and fragile hips. Blood tests charted cholesterol rise and insulin resistance. Doctors recorded fractures from minor falls, angina on exertion, and recurrent winter infections. Diaries and interviews described fatigue, slower reflexes, and diminished resilience, all aligning with ordinary biological aging. In stark contrast, files on Brooke Greenberg documented a different pattern. Growth charts barely climbed, teeth appeared irregularly, and brain scans revealed profound developmental disruption. Her skin and stature resembled that of a toddler, while internal organs showed varying stages of maturation and vulnerability. Pediatric specialists noted frequent hospitalizations and uncertain responses to treatment. These findings pushed researchers to speak of asynchronous aging, in which tissues advanced along separate clocks, yet still moved inevitably toward decline. The verdict in Henri Delorme's case had settled into a kind of uneasy stalemate. The court record showed suspicion, conflicting testimonies, and photographs that refused to line up neatly with ordinary expectations of age. Doctors of his era lacked any way to pass cellular damage or genetic variants, so they circled around words like imposture and miracle. A century later, those same yellowed files lay under cooler lights, re-examined as fragments of a biological puzzle rather than a moral trial. Researchers now compared claims like Delorme's with numerical signatures of aging, telomere length, epigenetic clocks, proteomic and metabolomic profiles. Blood and skin samples from exceptionally youthful septuagenarians travelled through sequencers and mass spectrometers, yielding dense columns of data where witnesses once offered anecdotes. In quiet clinics and research wards, volunteers sat for high-resolution imaging, muscle strength tests, and immune profiling, their unusually resilient bodies treated as living archives of slowed biological time. Despite these tools, every confirmed case still showed the same direction of travel. Cells accumulated damage, telomeres shortened, and mortality remained inescapable. Yet charts sometimes revealed slopes that were gentler than expected. Curves of decline shifted years to the right. Historical reports of apparent agelessness, once dismissed as superstition or fraud, now read as clumsy descriptions of such outliers. Their stories, including Delorme's, continued to press a single, precise question: why did some bodies age noticeably later than others?